Now let's take a look at two more annotations and how they relate to the database. The database-generated annotation lets me indicate that a field will be generated by the database. By default, entity keys are assumed to be generated by the database as identity keys. They use the database-generated option identity, but you don't need to explicitly use that annotation to get the behavior. In fact, if you don't want that to happen with entity keys, you can set database-generated to none. The third option is computed, and you can use this one when mapping to existing databases. But CodeFirst doesn't give you the ability to define what a formula should be in the database, so it's not as useful for database initialization. The NotMapped annotation lets you ensure the entity framework will overlook class properties that you don't want persisted in the database. So when you execute queries or save changes, any properties marked as not mapped will just be ignored. I'll use the createDate property to show you the database-generated annotation. If I were mapping to an existing database and the createDate, or date started in this case, column already existed, I might have a formula there that says when the row is first created in the database, put the current date or date time value into that field. If that were the case, then I can add an annotation here. I'll add DatabaseGenerated, and then the option computed. I'm going to turn off the database initialization so you can see how Entity Framework works with a computed column. Right now, my initializer will recreate the database every single time, so that won't work for this example. And I'll go into the database and create the formula on the start date field. Here's the change I've made to the database. So now date started will have a default value of getDate. So anytime I create a new row in this table, it'll automatically get the current date. There's two more important things to understand about specifying the computed column. I've turned off the database initialization in my code because I don't want Entity Framework to drop and recreate the database now that I've created the formula on my date started column. But CodeFirst is still going to be looking at the database because it needs to check to make sure the model hasn't changed. Even if I remove the database initialization, it still performs some initialization tasks. And it does that by reading this EDM metadata. So I'm going to get stuck between a rock and a hard place. The reason is because I just added that annotation, and CodeFirst is going to recognize that something's changed in the database, and it's going to want to do something about it. So the way to tell CodeFirst to just use the existing database and stop doing these checks for me is to just get rid of the EDM metadata file. That means for the time being, I'm breaking the database initialization. CodeFirst won't do any of that work anymore. So that's what I want. I'll delete it. Yes, that's fine. So now I'll be able to tell CodeFirst, don't pay attention to changes in my model and how it might impact the database. Just do what I tell you to do. So that's one piece. The other thing that you need to be aware of is, back in my class, the property that I applied computed to happens to be a date time, and by default, date time is non-nullable. So if I'm going to let the database create that value for me, that means I'm not going to provide the value. But if the value is non-nullable, then that's going to be interpreted as being required, and if I don't provide the value, I'm going to get an error. So in order to override that default, I'll use the C# shortcut to define that. So now I finally got everything in place so I can show you what computed actually does when I insert data into the database with Entity Framework. So here's a new alias. Remember, I put some code in there to give me a default date when date was important to have. So now I'm going to erase this date completely. And because it's nullable, MVC isn't going to give me a hard time about this being a required field. So I'll go ahead and click Create. Everything ran through fine. Notice that I've got a create date even though I didn't supply one. So now we'll take a look at SQL Profiler for more proof that when the insert was executed, there is still no date provided there. So the database created the date, and also notice that this command includes a select that pulls back all the database generated values. The primary key, my date started field, as well as the row version, because row version is also computed by the database. The key field and the timestamp field don't need the explicit annotation to get the behavior. So All of that worked so that you could see how a computed field works, and you're also seeing the default behavior of an identity database generated field as well.